Listen closely, because what you're about to hear could quietly change the way a man experiences confidence, connection, and presence in his most intimate moments. And most men never even realize they're missing it. There is a nightly habit so simple, so overlooked, that it slips past almost every man who believes performance is only about strength, stamina, or willpower. Yet the truth is far more subtle and far more powerful than that. When the day ends and the mind finally slows down, the body is still holding on to everything it has carried: stress, tension, pressure, emotional fatigue, and silent expectations, and most men go to sleep without ever releasing any of it, carrying it straight into the next day, and eventually into their relationships, where it shows up in ways they do not expect. Now imagine instead a quiet nighttime ritual, not rushed, not mechanical, but intentional, grounding, and deeply restorative. One that signals to the body that it is safe, relaxed, and fully present again. And this is where the idea of a nighttime oil routine becomes more than just self-care and starts becoming something that influences confidence, connection, and intimacy in a natural and almost effortless way. The reason this works is not because of magic or mystery, but because of how deeply the human nervous system responds to touch, scent, and intentional relaxation, especially when the mind has been overloaded all day. Most men ignore this entirely because they are conditioned to think performance begins in the moment. But in reality, performance is built long before that moment ever arrives, in the quiet hours when the body either resets or continues to accumulate tension. When a man introduces a calming oil-based self-massage routine before sleep, something subtle begins to shift over time. Not in an overnight transformation, but in a gradual recalibration of how the body responds to stress and relaxation. Warm oil on the skin, slow deliberate movements, and a quiet environment create signals that tell the nervous system to downshift, to release tightness in the muscles, to improve circulation, and to settle the mind into a calmer rhythm. And this calmness is not just physical, it becomes emotional. An emotional presence is something that often gets overlooked in discussions about intimacy, yet it is one of the strongest foundations of connection. Women are not simply responding to physical capability in moments of closeness. They are responding to presence, attentiveness, emotional grounding, and the sense that a man is fully there, not distracted, not tense, not carrying the weight of everything else into the moment. The nighttime oil routine works indirectly on all of this, because it trains the body to shift out of survival mode and into a more receptive, relaxed state. And when that becomes consistent, it begins to reflect in how a man carries himself during the day as well. There is also something deeply psychological about ritual itself. When a man takes even 10 or 15 minutes at night to slow down and care for his own body, it reinforces a sense of self-respect that most people underestimate. This is not about vanity or superficial grooming. It is about creating a moment where the mind stops performing for the world and simply returns to the self. Over time, this builds a kind of internal steadiness, a quiet confidence that does not need to be announced or proven, and that confidence naturally influences how he shows up in relationships. The oils themselves matter less than the consistency and intention behind the practice. Although certain natural oils have traditionally been associated with relaxation and improved skin and muscle comfort, which further enhances the experience of physical ease. The key is the slowing down, the deliberate attention to the body, and the removal of mental noise before sleep. Many men unknowingly carry physical tension in areas like the shoulders, lower back and neck. And this tension does not just affect posture, it subtly affects mood, patience, and emotional availability. When the body is tight, the mind becomes reactive. And when the mind is reactive, intimacy becomes rushed or disconnected rather than present and grounded. By contrast, a nightly routine that involves warm oil and slow self-massage begins to unwind these stored patterns of tension. And as the body relaxes, breathing deepens, sleep improves, and recovery becomes more effective, all of which contribute to overall vitality. Over time, this creates a noticeable shift in energy, not in an exaggerated or unrealistic way, but in the sense that the body feels lighter, the mind feels clearer, and the emotional space between partners becomes more open. And this is where most men are surprised, because they expect performance improvements to come from external fixes, but instead they find that the real transformation begins with internal regulation, with how calm and present they are in their own body. What makes this even more powerful is the psychological association that forms over time between relaxation and intimacy. When a man consistently ends his day in a state of calm, grounded awareness, his nervous system begins to learn that closeness and connection are not stressful or performance-driven experiences, but natural extensions of a relaxed state of being. This reduces pressure and overthinking, two of the biggest silent barriers in intimate relationships. And while this may sound subtle, it is often these subtle internal shifts that create the most meaningful improvements in how connection is experienced between partners. As this routine becomes part of a nightly rhythm, it stops being something you do and starts becoming something you embody, a transition point between the demands of the world and the restoration of the self. And in that space, confidence is not forced but rebuilt from within. This is where the deeper part of the process begins to unfold. And in the next section, we will go further into how this routine affects emotional presence, physical responsiveness, and the unseen dynamics that shape intimacy in ways most men never consciously recognize. Continuing from where this transformation deepens, it is important to understand that what changes in a man through a consistent nighttime oil routine is not just how his body feels, but how his presence is perceived by the person closest to him. And this shift often happens so gradually that it goes unnoticed until one day it becomes undeniable. When the nervous system is repeatedly guided into a calm, regulated state before sleep, the mind begins to carry that imprint into waking hours. And this is where emotional availability starts to increase in a very natural way. Instead of reacting quickly to stress or withdrawing under pressure, there is a greater sense of stability, a slower internal pace that allows for more thoughtful responses rather than impulsive ones. And in intimate relationships, this difference is deeply felt, even if it is never directly discussed. Many men underestimate how much emotional tension influences physical connection, because intimacy is not experienced in isolation from mood, stress, or mental clarity. It is shaped by them continuously, and when the body is carrying unresolved tension from the day, it often shows up as distraction, impatience, or a subtle sense of disconnect that both partners can feel even if they cannot always explain it. The nighttime oil routine becomes a bridge between that accumulated tension and a state of release, not because the oil itself is magical, but because the ritual forces a pause, a moment where the body is given permission to soften. This softening is not just muscular, it is neurological, as the repeated act of slow, intentional self-contact paired with relaxation signals to the brain that the day is ending, and there is no need to stay in a heightened state of alertness. Over time, this repeated signal helps shift the baseline of how the body responds to stress, making relaxation more accessible and recovery more efficient. In relationships, this translates into something subtle but powerful, which is the ability to be fully present without mentally drifting away, without carrying unfinished thoughts into moments that require attention and connection. Presence is often described as something abstract, but in reality it is deeply physical, rooted in breath, muscle tension, eye focus, and nervous system regulation. And when these are balanced, a man naturally appears more grounded and attentive without needing to consciously perform it. This is one of the reasons why partners often respond positively to men who seem calmer and more centered, because calmness creates emotional safety, and emotional safety is one of the strongest foundations of attraction and trust over time. The nighttime oil routine also plays an indirect role in how a man experiences his own body awareness. During the day, most men move through tasks in a forward-driven, goal-oriented state, where the body is simply a vehicle for action. But at night, when slow touch and attention are introduced, awareness shifts inward, reconnecting the mind to physical sensation in a gentle and non-pressured way. This reconnection is important because it rebuilds sensitivity, not in a literal sense of stimulation, but in the broader sense of being attuned to internal states such as tension, fatigue, relaxation, and comfort. When this awareness increases, it becomes easier to recognize stress earlier and release it before it accumulates, which again feeds into better emotional regulation. Over time, this creates a cycle where the body becomes more responsive to relaxation cues and less reactive to stress, and that balance has a direct influence on how intimacy is experienced, because intimacy thrives in environments where the body is not resisting itself. There is also a psychological layer to this routine that many men overlook, which is the quiet restoration of control over one's internal state. Throughout the day, external demands constantly pull attention outward: work, responsibilities, expectations, and digital distractions all fragment focus. And by the end of the day, many men feel mentally scattered without realizing it. The nighttime oil routine interrupts this fragmentation and brings attention back to a single grounding experience. This simple act of sustained attention becomes a form of mental training, reinforcing the ability to stay present for longer periods without distraction. As this skill develops, it naturally extends into conversations, emotional exchanges, and intimate moments where presence matters more than performance. Another important aspect is how this ritual affects sleep quality, not in a clinical sense of guaranteed outcomes, but in the way relaxation before bed prepares the mind for deeper rest. When the body is calm, and the nervous system is no longer in a heightened state, the transition into sleep becomes smoother, and smoother transitions often lead to more restorative rest. Better rest then feeds into energy levels, mood stability, and overall vitality, which all play a role in how a person shows up in relationships. What is often misunderstood is that intimacy is not a separate category of life. It is a reflection of overall internal balance. A man who is constantly fatigued, mentally overstimulated, or physically tense will naturally struggle to be fully present, regardless of intention, while a man who consistently restores his internal state creates more capacity for connection without forcing it. This is where the nighttime oil routine becomes less about the physical act itself and more about what it represents. A commitment to resetting the body and mind each day so that nothing accumulates silently over time. In many relationships, small emotional distances are not caused by lack of care, but by lack of recovery, where both individuals are carrying unresolved stress into shared moments without realizing it. By establishing a consistent nightly reset, a man reduces this invisible buildup and creates more emotional space for genuine connection to form naturally. This also influences confidence, but not in the exaggerated sense of dominance or outward display, rather in the quiet confidence that comes from feeling regulated within oneself. That internal steadiness is often what partners respond to most strongly, because it creates predictability, warmth, and a sense of emotional grounding that makes closeness feel easier and more natural. As this routine becomes integrated into daily life, it slowly reshapes the relationship a man has with his own body, his own mind, and by extension his partner, because intimacy is ultimately an interaction between two regulated or dysregulated nervous systems responding to each other. When one becomes more balanced, the dynamic between both naturally shifts, often in ways that are subtle at first, but become more noticeable over time in communication, affection, and physical connection. In the next part, we will go deeper into how this nightly ritual begins to influence long-term relational dynamics, desire, emotional resilience, and the deeper psychological layers of masculine presence and intimacy, and how all of these elements come together into a complete transformation rather than a temporary change. As this practice continues over weeks and months, something more subtle but far more important begins to emerge. And it is the shift from trying to improve performance to becoming someone whose presence naturally supports connection without effort or pressure. This is where most men misunderstand intimacy entirely, because they focus on isolated moments instead of the internal system that creates those moments. The nighttime oil routine, when done consistently, stops being about relaxation alone and starts becoming a form of emotional conditioning that reshapes how a man relates to stress, desire, and closeness itself. Over time, the body no longer treats the end of the day as a continuation of mental noise, but as a clear transition into recovery. And that transition becomes deeply stabilizing. What once felt like fatigue or emotional heaviness begins to soften into something more manageable, and the mind stops carrying unfinished emotional residue into the next day. This matters because emotional residue is one of the least visible but most powerful disruptors of intimacy. When unresolved tension sits in the body, it subtly influences tone of voice, patience, attention span, and even how touch is perceived and given. A man may not realize he is carrying it, but his partner often feels it as distance or absence, even when he is physically present. By creating a nightly ritual that actively releases this accumulation, the system begins to reset more completely, and with that reset comes a different kind of relational energy, one that is less reactive and more receptive. Another important shift that develops is in desire itself. Many people assume desire is purely spontaneous, but in reality it is highly sensitive to stress levels, sleep quality, and emotional safety. When the nervous system is overactivated or fatigued, desire often becomes inconsistent or muted, not because it is absent, but because the body is prioritizing survival over connection. As the nighttime oil routine helps regulate the nervous system, desire begins to stabilize not through force, but through restoration. This does not mean exaggerated intensity, but rather a more reliable and grounded sense of openness to intimacy. In long-term relationships, this stability is often more valuable than intensity, because it supports consistency and emotional security between partners. There is also a deeper psychological transformation that occurs, which is the reduction of internal pressure around performance. When a man is constantly measuring himself against expectations, whether internal or external, it creates a background tension that interferes with natural responsiveness. This pressure can make intimacy feel like a task rather than a shared experience, and even subtle pressure can disrupt flow and presence. The nightly oil routine helps dismantle this pattern indirectly by creating a space where there is no performance requirement at all, only presence and recovery. Over time, the mind begins to associate the body with relaxation rather than evaluation, and this shift is crucial because it allows intimacy to move away from mental monitoring and toward embodied experience. As this happens, confidence also changes shape. It becomes less about proving capability and more about trusting internal stability. This kind of confidence is not loud or reactive. It is steady, grounded, and quiet, and it often has a stronger impact on emotional connection than any external display of certainty. Partners tend to respond to this kind of presence with greater ease because it creates a feeling of safety and predictability, where emotional expression does not feel like it will be met with tension or withdrawal. Another layer that becomes more apparent over time is how this ritual influences communication within relationships. When a person is internally regulated, they are less likely to misinterpret tone, less likely to react defensively, and more capable of listening without immediate judgment or interruption. This improves emotional exchange in ways that directly support intimacy, because connection is not only built in physical moments, but also in how two people navigate everyday emotional interactions. Small improvements in patience, attention, and emotional clarity accumulate over time into a significantly healthier relational dynamic. There is also a long-term physiological benefit that supports everything else. When the body consistently transitions into deep relaxation at night, recovery processes improve, and improved recovery contributes to better energy regulation during the day. This means fewer emotional crashes, less irritability, and a more balanced baseline state. From this balanced state, intimacy feels less like a demand and more like a natural extension of connection. It becomes easier to engage fully without feeling depleted or distracted. What is important to understand is that this routine does not create change by adding something external to performance, but by removing internal obstacles that interfere with it. Tension, overstimulation, emotional fatigue, and lack of presence are not always visible, but they significantly shape how intimacy is experienced. By consistently addressing these internal layers, a man does not become someone different. He becomes more available to what is already possible within him. And that availability is often what creates the most meaningful shift in relationships, because it allows both partners to feel more seen, more connected, and more emotionally secure without needing to consciously work for it in every moment. When viewed as a whole, the nighttime oil routine is not about oils at all, but about creating a daily return to balance, a repeated act of self-regulation that slowly reshapes the nervous system, the mind, and the emotional landscape of intimacy. It is a quiet practice, but its effects accumulate in ways that are anything but quiet, influencing confidence, connection, desire, and emotional presence in a way that feels natural rather than forced. And in the end, the real transformation is not just in performance, but in the quality of connection itself, where intimacy becomes less about effort and more about presence, less about pressure and more about ease, and ultimately less about doing and more about being.